Rain poured down softly over Portland, painting the streets with a silver shimmer that caught the light from passing cars. Inside her small apartment, Clara stood by the window, arms folded, watching the rain slide down the glass. The night was quiet except for the sound of droplets and the faint hum of the heater. Her phone sat on the table behind her, screen dark, silent for hours. She had told herself not to care. She had told herself that waiting didn't matter. But it did. A week had passed since she last spoke to Evan. It wasn't a fight. Not really. It was one of those silences that began as a small pause and stretch into something larger, a space filled with unsaid words and pride. Both of them were stubborn. Neither wanted to reach out first. Yet tonight that pride felt heavier than usual. The apartment felt too empty to still, as if it were waiting for something or someone to break the quiet. Clara picked up her phone and unlocked it. The glow of the screen painted her face in pale light. Their old messages were still there, small jokes, reminders, late-night talks that used to go on until dawn. She scrolled slowly, feeling the warmth of old laughter that now felt far away. She hesitated for a long moment before typing a message. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, before she could stop herself, she wrote, "I miss how we used to talk." She pressed send. The message was out there now, floating in the digital silence between them. She placed the phone down and exhaled. Minutes passed, long and quiet. She almost gave up, telling herself it was foolish. Then the screen lit up. A message from him. "I do too. Maybe we forgot how." Her heart gave a small, unexpected jolt, the kind that comes when hope sneaks in quietly. She smiled without meaning to. For a moment, all the distance between them felt smaller, not gone, but less sharp. She typed again, this time slower, letting honesty guide her more than pride. "I talk better warm." Shay stared at the words. It was something she'd told him once before, that she could only speak freely when things felt warm, when the air between them wasn't filled with coldness or distance. He used to laugh at that, calling her dramatic. But he understood her better than most. She waited, expecting another reply. None came. The screen stayed silent. But something inside her shifted, a quiet decision forming without words. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was that small ache of missing someone who still mattered. She grabbed her coat from the hook near the door. It was the same coat she wore the last time they'd gone out together, dark gray, soft at the sleeves where his hands once rested, as she slipped it on. She looked around her apartment one last time, the blanket on the couch, the cup of tea she hadn't finished, the soft yellow light that made everything look smaller. She took a deep breath. Maybe she was being foolish. Maybe she wasn't. But staying still felt worse than leaving. She opened the door and a rush of cold air came in. For a moment she hesitated on the threshold. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "I talk better warm." The rain greeted her immediately, cool and steady against her face. She didn't run or shield herself with an umbrella. She just started walking steady steps down the wet sidewalk, her heart thudding quietly with each one. Behind her, the door of her apartment remained slightly open, swinging softly with the wind. The night smelled of rain and wet pavement. Streetlights cast a golden glow that shimmered across puddles, turning them into small mirrors. The city was calm, half asleep, with only a few cars passing. As she walked, Clara's mind replayed pieces of their last conversation. She couldn't even remember what started their silence. Maybe a misunderstanding. Or maybe just the kind of wariness that builds when people stop listening to each other. She thought about how Evan used to listen. Really listen, not with grand gestures, but with quiet patience. How he'd let her talk until her thoughts came out clear. He never interrupted, never tried to fix everything. He just sat there, steady. And that steadiness had once made her feel safe. Lately, she'd missed that more than she wanted to admit. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She stopped under a streetlight and pulled it out. One new message. From him. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the screen. "You mean warm like tea or warm like you walking here?" She laughed quietly. Right there in the rain. It was such an Evan thing to say. simple, teasing, but filled with hidden meaning. She typed quickly, her heart light for the first time in days. Maybe both. Then she slipped her phone back into her pocket and kept walking. The city stretched ahead, familiar, alive, and somehow new again. She didn't know what she'd say when she saw him. She didn't even know if he'd open the door right away. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let silence win this time. The rain started to ease as she turned the corner toward his street. Her steps grew quicker, not rushed but certain. She wasn't chasing a perfect ending, just a real one. The kind where two people try again, not because everything is easy, but because something still matters. When she reached his building, she paused at the gate. The windows glowed softly, and she wondered which one was his. She could almost picture him there, standing near the window, waiting, or maybe just hoping. The thought made her heart ache in a quiet, beautiful way. For a few seconds, she considered turning back. It would be easier, safer to go home and pretend the walk never happened. But then she thought of the message she'd sent and how true it was. She did talk better warm, and maybe tonight was her chance to prove it. She took a breath, brushed the rain from her hair, and pressed the buzzer next to his name. The metal button was cold under her finger. A moment passed, no sound, no movement. She pressed it again, this time holding it longer. Then, finally, the intercom crackled. His voice came through, soft and uncertain. Clara. Her lips curved into the smallest, most hopeful smile. "I told you," she said gently, her voice trembling with both nerves and affection. "I talk better warm." And before he could respond, she pushed open the gate and walked toward the door. Her reflection fading in the puddles behind her, and the door of her apartment still open somewhere across town, waiting for what might come next. Clara moved through the night, her steps quick and steady, the sound of her boots splashing against shallow puddles. The rain had softened to a mist, the kind that blurred the edges of streetlights and made everything look dreamlike. She pulled her coat tighter around her and kept walking, the city lights glimmering on wet asphalt like scattered stars. Every block brought her closer to Evan's building. Closer to the words she'd been holding inside for too long. Her heart raced. Not from the cold, but from the rush of what she was about to do. It wasn't just a walk anymore. It was a quiet apology, a small act of courage wrapped in rain. She thought of all the nights they used to spend together, not doing anything extraordinary, just talking about ordinary things that somehow felt important because they were shared. She missed that. She missed him. Evan lived only a few streets away in an old brick building with ivy climbing up its side. The walk wasn't long, but it felt like a lifetime. Each step carried a memory, the sound of his laughter, the way he tilted his head when he was trying to understand her, the warmth of the space they once shared. Somewhere along the way, that warmth had faded. Maybe they'd both forgotten how to reach for it. But tonight she wanted to find it again. A cold wind brushed her face as she turned onto his street. The trees lining the sidewalk swayed gently, scattering droplets from their leaves. The neighborhood was quiet, most windows dim, except for a few golden glows behind curtains. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, and she stopped beneath a flickering streetlight to check it. It was another message from Evan. "You're not really walking here, are you?" She smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cool air. Her thumbs tapped quickly against the screen. "Maybe I am." She waited, staring at the message thread, but there was no reply. She could almost imagine him there, reading it, unsure whether to hope or to brace himself. She slipped her phone away and continued walking, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of her steps. When she reached his building, she paused in front of the old metal gate. The vines that wrapped around the fence were glistening with raindrops, tiny mirrors catching the streetlight. Her reflection looked back at her damp hair, clinging to her cheeks, eyes filled with something between fear and longing. She wasn't sure which was stronger. She stood there for a moment, hands in her pockets, breathing in the quiet. The building looked the same as always, familiar, steady, a place she'd been both happy and heartbroken. She remembered the last time she was here. They'd sat on the stairs talking about everything they didn't know how to fix. Then, instead of saying goodbye properly, she'd just walked away. That memory still stung. But tonight she didn't want to leave things that way. She pressed the buzzer next to his name. Nothing happened at first. Only the faint hum of electricity filled the silence. She pressed it again. Then a crackle came from the small speaker. Clara. His voice sounded surprised, soft, cautious, and a little sleepy. It had been days since she'd heard it, but it still felt familiar, like a song she'd forgotten she loved. She swallowed and spoke, trying to keep her voice calm. "I told you," she said quietly. "I talk better warm." There was a long pause. Then the door clicked. She stepped inside, the warmth of the hallway wrapping around her like a soft blanket. The faint scent of coffee and old wood filled the air. The sound of her wet shoes echoed as she climbed the stairs. Her hand gliding over the railing she'd once leaned against on lazy afternoons while waiting for him to finish cooking. Everything felt both distant and close, like walking through an old memory that hadn't quite faded. When she reached the top floor, she stopped in front of his door. It looked the same, with a small dent near the handle and the faded welcome mat. She took a breath, lifted her hand, and knocked gently. Her heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the sound. The door opened before she could knock again. Evan stood there, barefoot, hair a little messy, wearing the same gray sweater she once teased him about for never throwing away. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, not in shock, but in quiet disbelief. As if he'd imagined this moment 100 times, but never truly expected it. They didn't speak right away. The space between them filled with the hum of rain still falling outside and the faint ticking of a clock. Somewhere inside his apartment. He looked at her coat, soaked from the walk, and then at her face. Searching for something, maybe an answer, maybe just a reason. "You're soaked," he finally said, his voice gentle. "I know," she replied with a small smile. "I couldn't wait." For a moment, he didn't move. Then he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. She walked past him, her heart still racing. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and coffee, a scent that always reminded her of him. The place hadn't changed much. The same couch, the same shelves filled with half-read books. The same photograph of the two of them at the lake, the one where she was laughing and he was pretending not to smile. She tried not to stare at it too long. He went to the kitchen and returned with a towel. She took it from him, their fingers brushing for a second that felt longer than it should. Neither spoke. There was no need. The silence now wasn't the cold kind they'd been living in for days. It was warm, fragile, like the moment before a long-awaited confession. As she dried her hands, she glanced toward the door. It was still open behind her, just slightly letting in a faint draft. Somehow, she didn't feel the urge to close it. She didn't know why. Maybe because part of her still didn't know if she'd be staying or leaving. Evan followed her gaze. "You left the door open again," he said softly. "Maybe because I wasn't sure if I'd want to close it," she whispered. Their eyes met. Not like before, not full of blame or pride, but with quiet understanding. The kind that only comes after you've missed someone long enough to realize that silence never really fixes anything. The rain outside grew lighter, almost gone. Clara set the towel aside and took a deep breath. The warmth of the room started to seep into her, melting the tension that had lived in her chest for days. Evan stood across from her, still looking uncertain, still waiting. She gave him a faint smile. "You still make the best tea in the city." His lips curved slightly. "I never stopped." And as he turned to the kitchen, she finally allowed herself to breathe, not because everything was perfect again, but because she had made it there, because she had chosen warmth over silence, and because sometimes love didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be brave enough to show up at the door. The warmth of Evan's apartment wrapped around Clara like a memory she didn't realize she missed. It was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint ticking of a wall clock. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, coffee, and something familiar home. She stood near the doorway, dripping rainwater onto the mat, while Evan disappeared into the kitchen. She could hear him opening cabinets, the sound of mugs clinking, the whistle of the kettle starting to build. Her heart hadn't settled yet. It beat fast, out of rhythm, half from nerves and half from relief. She hadn't planned what to say. She had just shown up because staying away had started to hurt more than coming back. Now, standing there in his apartment again, she realized how much she had missed even the smallest things, the sound of his footsteps, the calm way he moved, the steadiness in the air that always came with him. Evan returned with 2 mugs of tea, setting them down on the small wooden table. He didn't look at her right away, and she didn't push for eye contact. Instead, she removed her wet coat and draped it over the chair. The steam from the tea rose between them, curling softly in the warm air. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into her skin. "Still add too much honey?" she asked, her voice light but unsure. He smiled faintly, still looking down at his cup. "Still don't know how to make it any other way." That small answer broke something inside her, a quiet wall she hadn't realized she'd built. They both sipped their tea, the silence between them no longer sharp but soft, filled with unspoken understanding. The warmth of the room began to melt the cold distance they had carried for days. She looked around. The apartment was the same books stacked near the couch, a half-finished puzzle on the table, the same framed picture of the two of them from that summer by the lake. It had been one of their best days. They'd laughed until their faces hurt. She remembered how safe she had felt with him then, how she'd thought that safety would never fade. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," she said after a moment. He glanced up, eyes calm but full of something deeper. "I wasn't sure I should," he admitted, "but I guess I was waiting for a reason not to stay quiet anymore." Clara nodded, staring into her tea. "I kept thinking one of us would break the silence. Then I realized maybe it had to be me." Evan leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. "I thought you needed space." "I thought so too," she said softly. "But space just made it louder in my head." He didn't reply right away. The only sound was the rain outside, gentle now, like it was listening. She looked up at him, then really looked tanned, saw the same man she had fallen for, steady, thoughtful, and kind in the quietest ways. The tension between them wasn't gone, but it felt different now. It wasn't anger. It was longing that had nowhere left to hide. She smiled faintly. "You probably think I'm crazy for showing up like this." He shook his head. "No, I think you're just honest. You always have been, even when it's hard." Those words sat heavy in the air, not because they hurt, but because they were true. Honesty was what had drawn him to her in the first place. She spoke from the heart, always. But somewhere along the way, they had both stopped doing that. He took a step closer, stopping just a few feet from her. "Why tonight?" he asked quietly. She looked toward the window, where raindrops still slid down the glass. "Because I got tired of talking to the walls," she said. "And because I remembered something you once said." "What's that?" "That warmth makes everything easier." She paused, smiling faintly. "And I figured maybe it was time to find it again." Evan's expression softened. He didn't speak, but she could feel his answer in the quiet way he looked at her, like she had brought something familiar back into his life. He moved to the stove, poured more hot water into her cup, and said, "Then stay a little longer." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. She nodded and sat down at the counter. They talked then not about what had gone wrong, but about everything else. The small things. The weather, her work, a book he'd been reading, the plant she'd forgotten to water that probably didn't make it. Their conversation flowed easily, like a river finding its path again after being blocked for too long. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, and the air between them would thicken, heavy with something unspoken. But it wasn't uncomfortable, it was human, real. It was the kind of moment that reminded her why she had walked through the rain to get here in the first place. After a while, Clara stood up and walked to the window. The rain had almost stopped, leaving the city glistening under the streetlights. She watched the reflection of their faces in the glass. "You know," she said softly, "I left my door open when I came here." He frowned, slightly curious. "Why?" She turned to him, her voice calm but honest. "Maybe because I didn't know if I'd be coming back. Or maybe because I wanted a way back, no matter what happened tonight." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've always been like that. You leave space for possibilities." She smiled, a little wistful. "Guess I never learned how to close doors all the way?" Evan moved closer, resting his hand lightly on the back of her chair. "Maybe some doors aren't meant to be closed." Their eyes met again, and for a brief second, the world outside seemed to fade away, the rain, the city, the noise of everything else. There was only that quiet room, the warmth they had both missed, and the unspoken hope that maybe this was the start of something better. Clara felt her heart slow, finally matching the calm rhythm of the space around her. She hadn't realized how tired she was, tired of pretending not to care, tired of silence. She let out a slow breath and said softly, "I don't need everything to be perfect. I just don't want it to be cold anymore." Evan's voice was steady. "Then don't leave it cold." She nodded, her eyes glistening slightly, though she wasn't crying. The truth in his words sank deep. Maybe warmth wasn't something you found, it was something you made. Together, moment by moment, with honesty and care, as the clock ticked quietly on the wall. They sat back down, letting the conversation fade into comfortable silence. There were still things to fix, words to say, and feelings to understand. But for now, it was enough that they were both here. In the same room, choosing warmth over distance. Outside. The clouds began to part, and faint light from the moon slipped through the window. Resting softly on their faces, Clara glanced at the open door and smiled to herself. Maybe some doors were never meant to be shut completely, especially the ones that led back to where your heart felt understood. And for the first time in a long while, she felt it again, warmth, simple and real. The night had grown quiet. The rain had stopped completely, leaving behind the soft scent of wet pavement drifting through the slightly open window. Inside, the air felt gentler, now warm from the tea, from the heater. From something invisible but real that had settled between them. Clara sat on the couch, her legs folded under her, watching the city lights shimmer below. Evan sat beside her, close enough to feel her presence, but not close enough to touch. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm, peaceful, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt like she could breathe without the ache pressing on her chest. She looked at Evan, who seemed deep in thought, eyes fixed on the city outside. His profile looked softer under the dim light, familiar in a way that made her heart feel both safe and fragile. "You're quiet," she said softly. He smiled slightly, not turning to her. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange it feels," he said. "You sitting here again? Feels like no time passed, but also like a lifetime did." She nodded, understanding. "It feels that way to me too." They both watched the city in silence for a moment. The world outside looked washed clean by the rain, as if everything had been given another chance. Clara sipped her tea, now lukewarm, and placed the cup on the table. Her hands rested in her lap, fidgeting slightly. "There were so many things I wanted to say," she admitted. "But now that I'm here, I can't seem to find the right ones." Evan turned to face her, his voice calm but sincere. "You came. That says enough." She met his eyes and saw the truth there. Maybe it wasn't about perfect words or fixing everything in one night. Maybe it was about showing up, about warmth and effort and care. She smiled faintly, feeling a quiet relief. "I didn't plan to come," she said. "I just got tired of missing you." He looked down, his expression soft. "I miss you too, more than I wanted to admit." That simple confession hung between them like a fragile truce. They both smiled a little, the kind of smile that comes when something broken begins to mend. After a while, Evan stood up and walked to the kitchen, refilling their cups with fresh tea. The sound of pouring water filled the space, familiar and grounding. Clara leaned back on the couch, letting her gaze wander around the room. The photo on the shelf caught her eye, again the one from the lake. She got up and picked it up, brushing her thumb across the glass. "You never took this down," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "Didn't want to." She turned the frame slightly toward the light. "You look so serious in this one." "I was trying not to smile," he said, laughing quietly. You said I looked better that way. Clara laughed softly too, the sound light and real. It felt good to laugh with him again, to remember they were more than their silence. She set the photo back carefully and turned to face him. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that we just got lost for a bit?" He nodded. "I think we stopped listening and started assuming." She thought about that for a moment. He was right. They had both let pride speak louder than kindness. She took a deep breath. "I don't want that again," she said quietly. "I don't care about being right anymore. I just want to be honest." Evan leaned against the counter, his eyes steady on hers. "Then let's start there." Clara walked over and sat at the table again. The warmth from the cup in her hands felt grounding, real. "You know," she said, smiling faintly, "you're not the easiest person to talk to when you shut down." He chuckled. "And you're not exactly patient when you're hurt." "Fair," she admitted, laughing softly. Then she grew serious. "But I don't want to walk away every time it gets hard." "You don't have to," he said simply. Those words, quiet and sure, settled deep inside her. She looked at him, realizing that love didn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes it was just this two people choosing not to walk away. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the faint sound of cars passing. Time seemed slower now. They talked more about small things, simple things. About how work had been tiring, about the new coffee shop near her apartment. About a movie he'd watched that she'd once said she wanted to see. The conversation flowed easily with no effort. As if they'd both remembered how to speak the same language again. When the clock neared midnight, Clara stood and stretched. "I should probably go," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Evan looked at her quietly for a moment, then said, "Do you have to?" She hesitated, smiling. "Maybe not, but I probably should." He nodded, accepting but not happy about it. She grabbed her coat from the chair, shaking off the last bits of dried rain. When she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. She looked back at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not closing the door when I knocked." He smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You left it open. I just didn't shut it." Clara laughed gently, the kind of laugh that carries warmth instead of sadness. She opened the door slightly wider, feeling the cool air from the hallway brush her face. It wasn't as cold now. Somehow, even the night felt softer. "I'll see you soon." She asked. Evan nodded. "You will." For a moment, neither moved. Their eyes met, and in that quiet look was everything apology, forgiveness, hope. Then Clara turned and stepped out into the hall. The door stayed open behind her, just a few inches. Enough for light from the apartment to spill out onto the floor as she walked down the stairs. She thought about that open door, the one here. And the one back home, she hadn't closed either. Maybe she'd leave it that way for a while. Not because she was uncertain, but because some doors once opened don't need to be shut right away. Sometimes they just need space to let the warmth travel both ways. Outside, the city was quiet. The rain had left tiny reflections on the street, catching the glow from windows and streetlights. She started walking, her steps steady, her heart lighter than when she had arrived. The world felt different, not perfect, but peaceful. The kind of peace that comes after finally saying what needed to be said. She took out her phone and saw a message notification. It was from Evan, just for words, "Doors still open here." Clara smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She looked up at the sky where the clouds were parting to reveal faint stars. Her breath came out softly, and she whispered to herself, "Good." Then she kept walking, hands in her pockets, the city lights glowing around her. The night no longer felt cold. Somewhere behind her, a door was still open in. That was enough.